I kept a letter in the back of my drawer for 42 years, and I convinced myself I was stronger for never opening it. The truth is, I was afraid of what it might ask of me. My name is Harold Whitaker. I am 79 years old, and that unopened envelope from my younger brother sat beside my socks and winter gloves for nearly half my life. It arrived in the spring of 1984, folded into a plain white envelope with my name written in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Daniel always pressed hard with his pen, like he was trying to carve his words into the paper so they could never be erased. We had not spoken in 3 years by then. 3 years might not sound like much, but when you come from a family where you shared a bedroom, a bicycle, and sometimes even a pair of shoes, 3 years of silence feels like a continent. The fight that split us was not dramatic in the way strangers might expect. There were no broken windows or police cars. It was a kitchen table argument after our father's funeral. We were both exhausted, both grieving, both certain we were right. The subject was money, but the truth was pride. Daniel believed I had controlled too much of our father's care in his final months. I believed Daniel had stayed away too long and returned only to criticize. Words were said that should never be spoken between brothers. I told him he had no right to question me. He told me I had always needed to be in charge. We stood up from that table and walked in opposite directions, each convinced the other would eventually apologize. When the letter arrived 3 years later, I was standing in my small kitchen with my wife, Margaret. She handed it to me and said, "It's from Daniel." I remember the way my stomach tightened. I turned the envelope over in my hands. It was not thick, it was not heavy. Just a few sheets of paper, most likely. I could have opened it right there. Instead, I said I would read it later. I slid it into the drawer beside the refrigerator, the one where we kept spare batteries and takeout menus. Later became tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. And then something strange happened. The longer I left it unopened, the heavier it felt, even though it weighed almost nothing. In my mind, that envelope began to carry every possible accusation. I was certain it contained blame or anger or a list of all the ways I had failed him. I told myself I did not need to read it because I already knew what it would say. That is the lie fear tells you. It convinces you that imagination is safer than truth. Months passed, then years. Margaret would sometimes ask, gently, if I had ever opened Daniel's letter. I would shrug and say it did not matter anymore. I told her that if Daniel truly wanted reconciliation, he would call. I said that a letter was not enough. Those were my words. What I meant was that a letter required me to sit still and face whatever was written inside, and I did not trust myself to do that without becoming angry again. Life continued in the way life does. We raised our 2 daughters. I worked long hours at the hardware store I eventually came to own. Daniel moved to another state. I heard bits and pieces about him through distant relatives. He had a son. He changed jobs twice. He went through a divorce. Each time I received news about him, I felt a flicker of something that might have been regret. But I would close the drawer and remind myself that he had walked away too.
There is a peculiar comfort in unresolved conflict. As long as nothing is spoken, nothing can be proven. I could preserve my version of events untouched. In my story, I had done my best for our father. In my story, Daniel had overreacted. The unopened letter protected that story. If I never read his words, I would never have to consider that my memory might be incomplete. When our mother fell ill in the early 90s, I wondered if that would be the thing that brought us back together. I considered calling him. I even picked up the phone once. But pride is a patient companion. It whispered that if Daniel wanted to make things right, he knew where to find me. So I handled our mother's affairs much the same way I had handled our father's, and I did not tell him until the end was near. He came to the hospital, stood at the foot of her bed, and nodded at me as if I were a distant acquaintance. We spoke about her medication and the weather. We did not speak about the letter. After she passed, he left town before the funeral reception was over. I went home that evening and opened the drawer. The envelope was still there, slightly yellowed at the edges. I held it in my hands and felt something close to panic. I realized that if I opened it now, I would have to confront not just the original argument, but the additional years of silence I had allowed to stack on top of it. So I closed the drawer again. Margaret died 10 years ago. Cancer does not negotiate. In the quiet months after her funeral, the house felt larger than it ever had before. Without her gentle presence, there was nothing to distract me from my own thoughts. One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork, I found the letter again. It had been moved from the kitchen drawer to my bedroom dresser at some point, though I do not remember doing it. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at Daniel's handwriting. For the first time, I felt not anger, but fear of something else entirely. I was afraid that if I waited any longer, there would be no one left to forgive. By then, Daniel and I were both in our 70s. We had grandchildren we had never introduced to each other. We had shared memories that no one else in the world could fully understand, and we were letting them fade in isolation. I began to see the cost of my silence not as a matter of pride, but as a subtraction. Every holiday without him was a subtraction. Every story about our childhood that I did not get to retell with him was a subtraction. The letter was no longer just paper. It was evidence of a crossroads I had refused to step onto. 2 months ago, on the morning of my 79th birthday, I woke up earlier than usual. There is something about nearing 80 that makes you aware of the clock in a way you cannot ignore. I went to the dresser, opened the drawer, and took out the envelope. My hands were not steady. I told myself that whatever was inside could not harm me more than 42 years of avoidance already had. I opened it carefully so as not to tear the paper. There were 3 pages. The first line read, "Harold, I am writing because I do not trust myself to say this without getting angry, and I am tired of being angry." I had to stop reading for a moment. That sentence alone dismantled decades of assumptions. He was not writing to accuse me. He was writing because he feared his own temper, the same temper I share. As I continued, I realized that the letter contained no list of my failures. It contained his regret. He wrote that he felt he had abandoned our father during those final months, and that he had projected his guilt onto me. He admitted he had been harsh. He asked if we could try again, even if it meant starting with a simple phone call. He ended the letter by saying, "You are still my brother, even if we have forgotten how to act like it." I sat there with those words in my lap and felt something inside me give way. For 42 years, I had defended myself against accusations that had never been written. I had constructed an entire emotional fortress against an attack that did not exist. The tragedy was not that Daniel and I had fought. Brothers fight. The tragedy was that I had allowed fear to decide the length of our punishment. That same afternoon, I found his number through his son. My voice trembled more dialing those digits than it ever did asking Margaret to marry me. When Daniel answered, there was a long pause after I said my name. Then he laughed softly and said, "I was beginning to think you had forgotten me." I told him about the letter. I told him I had just read it. He was quiet for a moment and then said he had assumed I threw it away. We talked for nearly 2 hours. We did not resolve every misunderstanding from the past, but we acknowledged them. We admitted we had both been stubborn. We admitted we had both been hurt. More importantly, we admitted we had wasted time neither of us could recover. There was no dramatic reunion. No swelling music, just two aging men comparing blood pressure readings and grandchildren's birthdays, trying to rebuild a bridge we should never have burned. I sometimes think about the version of myself who left that envelope unopened in 1984. He believed he was protecting his dignity. He believed that waiting gave him control. What he did not understand was that waiting has a cost. Pride feels powerful in the moment, but over decades it becomes expensive. It charges interest in the form of missed birthdays, unattended weddings, and conversations that will now never happen because our parents are gone. If there is one thing I have learned at 79, it is that reconciliation rarely arrives in a perfect package. It comes in imperfect handwriting, in awkward phone calls, in sentences that begin with "I was wrong." The longer you delay those sentences, the heavier they become. I do not know how many years Daniel and I have left to speak to each other. We are both aware that time is no longer an abstract idea. But I am grateful that the last chapter of our relationship will not be defined by silence. I am grateful that the story of my life will not include the sentence, "I never opened it." If you are holding on to something unread, something unsaid, something you are certain will confirm your worst fears, I will not tell you what to do. I will only tell you what waiting did to me. It stole 42 years that could have been different. It preserved my pride and diminished my family. And in the end, the letter I feared most contained not condemnation, but an invitation. At my age, you begin to measure life not in ambitions, but in reconciliations. I cannot go back to that kitchen table after our father's funeral. I cannot give my daughters an uncle who was present at every holiday. But I can answer the phone when my brother calls tomorrow. I can say his name without bitterness, and I can tell you, with the steadiness that only comes from regret, that the cost of waiting is almost always higher than the cost of forgiveness.